Hey everyone, Christopher here with another crispy writing tip. I am currently sitting inside of my reading closet, and yes, I have a reading closet. It's nice to have a cave-like space that one can retreat to in order to read in peace and quiet. And no, that is not a copy of Aragon there. That is actually a mock-up that my UK publishers did at one point to test how the cover was going to look. They did a series of books, a series of covers for the Inheritance Cycle with adult covers, and that's one of the versions. Anyway, and this isn't all of the reading pile either. There are several levels here. I'm more of a reading mountain, as you can see. If I ever have the time to read all of these books, it probably means that I'm not writing, which unfortunately leads me to suspect I will never actually make my way through all of these books, although I'm trying. It doesn't help that I continually replenish this pile. In any case, today's crispy writing tip is on point of view. I'm going to talk to you about the different types of point of view from a sort of working writer's perspective, give you my take on them. If you want a more in-depth technical examination of point of view, of course, you would be best served by finding a book on writing that would deal with this. So first of all, I want to preface all of this by saying that you should write with whatever point of view makes sense for you, your characters, and your story. This is a very personal thing, but there are some advantages and there are some disadvantages to the different points of view. I'm going to start with the simplest one in a lot of ways, which is first-person point of view. It's simple and easy in one sense because it forces you to write with the voice of your character. You know, and if that's something you struggle with, first person can help you with that. Now, I've never actually written in first person because I don't find myself drawn to it. One of the reasons is that if you are writing your entire story from start to finish in first person and there's no real time jumps in between where you reset the narration, then there is an assumption that your character has survived and your character knows how the story ends. And therefore, why won't the narrator, why won't the first person point of view just tell you how everything ends? You can get away with this through a whole bunch of different techniques. One is to reset the narration or reset the time period of the narration during your story. As an example, you could start your story in a certain place, in a certain time, and have your character narrating what happened over the past day or two. And then you go to another chapter, or go to another section of the book, and you jump forward another couple of days, and now the character is just narrating what has happened over that period of time also. That kind of helps get around that problem of why doesn't the character just tell us what happens in the end? And of course, we know that they live, so that removes a lot of narrative tension. Theoretically, you could end a story in mid-sentence at the end of it when your character dies, if your character dies, but that could also be very unsatisfying. You can also write in present tense, and tense is one of those things that gets tied up with your point of view character stuff, because tense influences how readers experience the point of view of your character, and the point of view you choose will possibly influence which tense you want to use, whether past, present, future, or some of the more complicated subvariants thereof. So there's first person. You could write that in present tense, which helps solve one of those problems, but present tense is a non-standard tense, and a lot of people will have difficulty reading it. Just to be very clear, past tense would be, I walked into the room. That happened in the past. Present tense would be, I walk into the room. That means it's happening at this exact moment. Future tense would be, I will walk into the room, and so forth and so on. There's, I wasn't going to mention it, but I'll just throw it out. There is also a second person point of view, which is where you are saying exactly that. You are saying. So you would write a story saying, you walk into a room. You will do this. You have done this. That is very difficult. It's usually only done for choose your own adventure stories, things like that, experimental fiction. It can be powerful because it places the reader specifically in the scene in that exact moment, but it can also come across very bossy. You the writer, are telling the reader that they are doing these things, And you run the risk that your reader's mind will rebel and say, no, I didn't walk into the room. I didn't do X, Y, Z. For that reason and the tense issue, second person tends to be less, it's probably the least used of all the point of views. First person is used quite a bit more, but as I said, I tend to have difficulty connecting with it as a writer. As a reader, I have no trouble reading first person. Okay, next we go to omniscient point of view. This is not used as often these days, which is somewhat of a pity. Omniscient, you can imagine omniscient point of view as a movie camera that lets you see everything in the story, where everyone is, what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're feeling at any moment. The omniscient narrator can dive into the minds of those characters, wherever they are, whatever they're feeling, whatever they're thinking, and can share them with the reader. But you notice I said narrator, because omniscient viewpoint almost implies that there is a narrator. Now, if you're writing like a folk tale or The Hobbit. The Hobbit is a great example. The Hobbit has a narrator. The narrator is the storyteller who is telling you the story. And it can be a wonderful technique for compressing large amounts of material, long periods of time, multiple characters. If you're writing a really, really big epic and it's going to be too difficult to handle it in the perspective of one or two or even a large number of characters, then omniscient point of view becomes incredibly useful. Now, what are the downsides of omniscient narration? Well, it tends to keep you from really latching onto any one character, and it can be disorienting for the readers if you, the author, are bouncing around in the heads of different characters, not just from scene to scene, but possibly even within the same sentences or paragraphs. It can certainly be done. It can be done really well, and there are a lot of great examples from classical literature, but you tend to see it less these days. I would love to see a little bit more omniscient narration, but again, you have to figure out if it's right for your story. Okay, now we come to third person. Now, what's the difference between third person and omniscient, you might ask? It's really just a question of scope. Third person is omniscient, but it focuses on one person. You can now think of this as a movie camera that is latched onto one person and follows that person around for the duration of the story or the duration of a certain period of a story. That period might be a chapter, it might be a scene, it might be any length of time, but in third person, you indicate through a line break or a chapter break or some other significant marker whenever we switch to another character. So when I followed Aragon around, for example, that was in third person. I would follow him. If I switched point of view to Nasawada or some other character, I would do it with a double line break, sometimes with an asterisk in there, a couple of asterisks if it was falling at the top of the page or bottom of the page. But usually, and I think this is what I mainly did, I would just do that with a chapter break to really tell the reader, hey, we're switching viewpoints. Switching viewpoints can be jarring for readers, so that's something that you should introduce fairly soon, and it helps if we've already met the character whose viewpoint we're shifting into, so that we don't completely lose the sense of where we are or what's going on. There are some authors who do really well with shifting around to a lot of different viewpoints. This is going back a little bit, but Tom Clancy did this quite a bit in his stories. He also tended a little bit more towards omniscient, but usually he was writing in third person, and then he would pop around to different characters to sort of flesh out his very large thriller stories. One question you have to decide when using third person is what level of immersion you're going to give the readers. So, okay, you've decided you're going to write third person. You've decided you're going to, you've latched onto one character at a time and you're going to be following them around. But then you have to say, what depth of experience am I going to give the readers? And by that I mean, if we imagine our movie camera that's following around a character, that movie camera could be outside the character, which would allow you, the writer, to show the readers things that the character themselves can't actually see, even though we're still only following one character around. Perfect example of this would be the character cries. In general third person, you could tell the reader that the tears looked like whatever, you can tell the readers what the tears look like as they roll down the character's cheeks. Because again, the movie camera can see that. If we zoom in and zoom into the character's head and only see and feel what that character is seeing and feeling, this is what's known, often referred to as limited third person. In that case, when the character cries, you could tell the reader how the tears feel, you could talk about the emotions and the thoughts that the character is feeling, but you could never describe what those tears look like on the cheeks of the character unless the character goes and looks at themselves in a mirror or some other reflective surface. What are the advantages of third person beyond this? Well, limited third person is the most common viewpoint used in fiction. I use it in my fiction for the most part, and it's the most commonly used viewpoint because it really allows you to bond with the character and experience the world as they are experiencing it. One of the major downsides of this, though, is it takes a lot of words to make things happen. Because if you skip things, it really becomes obvious that there's a narrator or an outside editor who's interfering with the character's experience of the world or snipping out parts of it. This is why a lot of books like Stephen King's or a lot of my most recent one, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, which are written in limited third person, tend to be very large. It's not impossible to write a short book in limited third person, but you really have to work hard to control that length. It's also possible to combine viewpoints. So, for example, you can do a narrative within a narrative. A classic example of this would be starting in first person. Someone goes into a bar. You say, I went into the bar on Thursday night, and there was a guy sitting at the end of the, at the end of the bar, and he'd had a couple of drinks, and he started talking to me, and he told me the most amazing story. And the story that gets told would most likely be then in third person. It could be in another viewpoint, but it would usually be in third person. So you've nested a third person story within a first person story. And of course, that third person story has a narrator, which allows you to do other techniques also. Something else I forgot to mention with first person is that I, as a reader and as a writer, often wonder why in a first-person narration, the character would choose to describe things the way they often do. It can be very easy to slip into a writerly mode and describing things the way you want to as the writer, but not the way the character would actually think about them or feel about them unless they're consciously constructing the narrative for someone to read later, which is always possible. If it's a book composed of letters, the way Dracula is, then you have a little bit more freedom. Those letters can be in first person. They can be composed after the events that are being described and have various literary effects as a result. So those are the general big chunks of the general big techniques used with point of view. It's omniscient, it's third person, limited third person, and then first person. As I said, second person is kind of out there. Personally, again, if I'm choosing, I default towards limited third person. I've had a lot of fun with that. I find it incredibly versatile, and I've used it for the majority of my stories. I have written a story in second person present tense, actually second person imperative, which again is like, you will go into this. Well, that's future tense. You will do this. You have done this. Things like that. And that worked for a certain story that I do hope to release in the near future. But in general, I default to limited third person. And if you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. So anyway, that's my ChrisP tip for the week. A little bit longer than others, but I hope it's of some help. As always, go forth, be awesome, and I'll be back soon.